Hi everyone, I'm Harv, Ian Harvey, founder of Collective Intelligence, and this is Stuff That Matters Now. Welcome back, Rod Oram. We spoke here 21st of January 2020 in the same building here in the BNZ downtown, and what a year it's been since that time. Welcome back, Rod. Thank you for the annual Rod Oram podcast here with me.
Well, kia ora, Harv. It's great to be back, and it has indeed been an extraordinary year.
And we were just reflecting that this time last year we knew that COVID existed, but we were both pretty naive about what it could actually deliver in the world. And because from memory, I don't think we talked about it much, if at all.
I think I'd be embarrassed to go back and listen because I suspect it was probably almost nothing, if nothing.
Yeah.
And this is by no means an excuse that I'm offering on my part. But at that stage, I was certainly thinking about COVID the way I had been thinking about SARS, where SARS was ostensibly a similar sort of pandemic. But it tracked very differently from the way COVID did. And one of the lessons from SARS was it didn't spread. It was very deadly, but it was relatively less contagious. And so I was still focusing on thinking, oh, yeah, well, that's one of those diseases that they get in China and thereabouts.
Over there.
Yeah. And I was far too casual about it. I was also very focused on leaving 3 weeks later for my bike ride from Cape Reinga to Bluff, which was a wonderful 28-day bike packing trip to Aotearoa. And I must admit my head was rather more on that rather than...
So, Rod, the question is, are you on to it today?
I am.
You are?
Very much so.
You've got a list, you've got your laptop open, and right, so we're going to do a better job this year. And last year, Rod, I was interested to the framing up of this annual event to get to know you more. We're not going to do that today. We don't care about you, Rod. We just want to know what's in your head, okay, and try and draw that out. So, Rod, you've got a framework of what you want to talk about today. What is that?
I'm very preoccupied by the idea that this is an incredibly essential year for us in New Zealand for reasons I'm about to explain. And the decisions we make this year will fundamentally determine how good or not our future is long term. And that crucial year is the year that we finally get around to setting ourselves some carbon budgets and pathways and policies for reducing our carbon emissions. So this is the timetable that the Climate Change Commission's on. Just a week ago today, the 1st of February, it released its draft recommendations for the government on its first 3 5-year carbon budgets, each sinking, as we're on that trajectory towards net zero. And then a very useful discussion about potential pathways. It's a very big document. It's 180 pages of recommendations, plus a separate document of 650 pages of evidence. But it's something you can dip into because it's very well structured in terms of what you think it might mean for your business or your life. So I'm encouraging everybody. I almost sort of walk up to strangers on the street saying, you really must put in a submission to the Climate Change Commission, in these precious few weeks left. And there's lots of simple links on the Commission website to tell people how to do that, because it's really important that the Commission has as much feedback as possible. Then it thinks about that and produces its final recommendations to government in May.
Yep.
And then the government's got essentially 2 big decisions to make.
So before we get into that, so that's one subject, the carbon budget. Democracy was another one?
Yes. The next one is democracy, because that the health of our democracy is, again, very crucial in how we make those decisions, how we have those discussions. And then the third thing that flows from that is about society itself. What we've been learning about ourselves in this extraordinary past year, and what are some good things, and there'll be some negative things in there too, that we have learned about ourselves, that's very much about this story, about how this year we set ourselves on a track which will have a very big influence about what our future looks like. Okay. I say good or bad, depending how well we do this.
So the health of democracy, society and carbon budget. Where do you want to start?
Well, I'll start with the first one because, of course, this isn't just narrowly about carbon emissions. It's about how we produce those emissions, how we reduce them. But it's about how we have a huge impact on all of Earth's systems, not just climate change, but on health of ecosystems, of biodiversity, and the like. And in other words, our relationship with our life support system, which is the planet, and the extraordinary degradation of those life systems that we've caused. And there's plenty of evidence for it, and very many very accessible ways of looking at it. So David Attenborough's always been good on these issues, but as the years gone by, he's become even more forceful on it. And so his most recent series to the BBC, which is just recently out, is crystal clear. So it's actually about our relationship with the entire living Earth, if you like, of which this discussion about what the Climate Change Commission's up to and our carbon budgets is important, because those decisions we make about emissions and how we deal with them is actually a fundamental part about getting re-establishing a much healthier relationship with the planet.
So, Rod, what do you say to people that will claim New Zealand's just a speck on the planet, what we do here doesn't matter?
All sorts of responses to that. The first one is that our emissions per capita are high. The second one is that small countries count, and therefore countries of our size around the world in aggregate add up to about a quarter of emissions. The third one is that we are all responsible, and if we behave irresponsibly, we are not only sending the wrong signal, setting the wrong example to other people in other countries. We're not encouraging them, just as we would hope to get encouragement from them. But we're also hugely shooting ourselves in the foot, because we have remarkable opportunities here in New Zealand to address these issues in ways far more wholesome and beneficial to the way we do things here and to our ecosystems, our biodiversity, our ecosystem health, than some other countries. So as a country, we've got one of the largest stocks of natural capital per capita in the world for a nation outside oil and gas nations. And that natural capital is an enormous resource for us, but we've been depleting it very badly and treating it very badly. So if we embark on some big revolutions in everything we do, not just the energy we use and how we use it, but in farming systems and the like, we have this tremendous opportunity to restore and help nature restore the health of ecosystems, which then makes them more resilient to things like climate change and more productive. And so that's another good reason why we should be addressing this. It's where our best opportunities lie.
So when you say the natural store, are you talking about water?
Water's one, soil, climate generally. Our oceans are extraordinary. We've got the 9th largest oceanic resource in the world in terms of our exclusive economic zone, and that's one of the healthier chunks of ocean in the world, not as badly fished out as others. So it's all of those things. It's the diversity of species as well, and the like. These are all elements of natural capital.
And you know, we were saying before before we came on here, is we've stopped having the conversations around is it a thing or not. No, I don't think anybody is talking about is climate change a thing. I think enough people now are going, it's a thing, we need to do something about it.
That's true, but that doesn't get us over the hump, because there are still lots of people who say, well, we've got to do something about it, but it's either too hard or too expensive or too difficult or too disruptive. It feels impossible to do. And I think the way I try to explain this to people, or try and give them confidence on this, is that when you're sitting here in the present and you're looking ahead, it's very hard to look ahead. You don't know quite what that future holds. And any view of the future can often be, by and large, just an extension of the present or recent past that you know. But if you do a wonderful thing which is known as standing in the future, if you imagine the future you want to have for yourself, for your family, your community, for your country, for the world, and then having got a good idea about that, based very much on sound, rational analysis about what's available and what could be done. But then you look back, you backcast rather than forecast. When you backcast to where you are today, you can see far more clearly about the steps you took. And so for me, the key to this is to imagine the future you want, and then work out backwards how you get there. And in fact, one of the best books around is just published late last year, called The Future We Choose, by Cristiana Figueres, who is the very wonderful Costa Rican diplomat who was chair of the United Nations climate negotiations process. She took up that job immediately after the debacle of Copenhagen and chaired that process all the way through to the successful conclusion of the Paris Agreement in 2015, and she's still very active. And she says in this book that we know all the things we need to do, and so that's why we have to choose a future. And actually making no choices, just sitting there sort of dumbstruck or frightened or paralyzed, is in itself a decision. Yep. and that will dictate the future you get. And so I would hugely recommend that book.
So the book is The Future?
The Future We Choose.
And, okay, so we'll put that up on as a link to this podcast as well.
The other book I'd mention in this context is called, the title is Hope in Hell, and the author is Jonathan Porritt, the very wonderful British environmental leader, indeed son of Arthur Porritt, Governor General, although Jonathan was already growing up in England by the time his father became Governor General, and so for many decades Jonathan was just a visitor here. But in recent years he's become much more involved. So he's working, and his very excellent organisation, Forum for the Future, is working with a number of major corporates here. He is, for example, on the Sustainability Board of Air New Zealand, for example. And Forum for the Future is also working with Fonterra. And Jonathan is a terrific writer, and his book, which came out a little bit earlier last year, kind of mid-year, is called Hope in Hell. And he's basically making the case that we've got absolutely only a decade left. And if I could just read you this quote, because it gets to a really interesting point, which to me is very central, and it comes back to my question about democracy and society in due course. This is a direct quote from him. "This is literally the last decade in which authentic, grounded hope will be available to anchor everything we can do to save our families, friends, and future generations. We have no alternative but to commit to more radical political action, to get as many people as possible involved in campaigning activities just as soon as possible, to bring such pressure to bear on our political systems while we still have time, to shift from today's wholly inadequate incrementalism to full-on emergency response. The case for civil disobedience is now overwhelming." So this is...
I've heard that quote before.
Yeah, a bastion of the British establishment of a certain sort, Sir Jonathan Porritt. But he's very clear he means, of course, non-violent civil disobedience. So it's rather gentlemanly in that sense, but still very forceful. And I'll come back to that point as we get into a discussion about democracy and society in due course.
Rod, could you paint us a picture of what the future you would want for New Zealand?
Yes, very straightforwardly. I'm reluctant to use the kind of the lifeboat metaphor, but in the sense that we, as an island low down in the South Pacific, have a little bit more room for manoeuvre than some other large land masses elsewhere. We've still messed this land mass and these waters around quite a bit, I'd have to say. In the sort of 200 years almost since colonisation began, this has been a very rapid degradation of those ecosystems. But we've still got everything we need here to be able to discover and build a new relationship with nature, where everything we do works with nature, not against it. And that's when, by giving, if you like, taking our foot off the neck of nature, we're giving those earth systems a chance to recover, and then be greater support to us. Now, of course, we're in a global context. If global temperatures change, we can't ourselves affect that. But we've got the opportunity here to be able to respond very fully to all of these challenges in a very positive way. Now, if we look at New Zealand in a sense in two different ways, the first one is urban New Zealand. So we have a higher proportion of people in New Zealand living in towns and cities than in most European countries, for example.
I don't know that.
Yeah, absolutely. We're far more urban than we think we are. We tend to define ourselves as a nation by our rural and wild places and our rural economy. But that's the primary sector, even sort of second-order jobs, the job in the warehouse in Ashburton, you struggle to get beyond about 15% of GDP. The primary sector is really important, but it's not everything. So in urban New Zealand, we've got a wretched urban form in New Zealand, which is very dispersed, very low density, and therefore we have a fair degree of madness for transport and everything else. And we've compounded that by making housing far more expensive than it needs to be. So we've got these huge urgent urban issues to respond to, which are all part of climate change, all part of sustainability. And we can do that in very distinctive New Zealand ways. Then the other half is the primary sector and our rural communities. Yes, we are, as a country, good farmers with conventional farming systems as we know them. But there is this extraordinary revolution going on in the world in land use and farming and food that we can play a very distinctive role in. It will still be dairy and sheep and beef, I think, will remain very, very substantial parts of our agricultural output, rather than suddenly a big swing to horticulture, for example. But it's really important that we learn how to make those farming practices as sustainable as possible. That's where we get into the whole field of regenerative agriculture. And ruminant animals play a really important part naturally in restorative processes. The Great Plains of the United States, where you had these enormous herds of bison thundering across them. Those grazing animals, which grazed that land very lightly and then moved on, their biological processes, the shit they left behind and the urine they left behind and all the rest, and the churning up of that ground, helped give rise to very healthy ecosystems. So how do we learn to farm in a way that quite steadily brings down the methane emissions, because those are very serious greenhouse gases. And there are farmers around the country who are already well on that journey. Make sure that we are on this journey to regenerative agriculture. And the great opportunity is this. Other new foods that are coming along, like meat grown from stem cells or things brewed in biochemical bioreactors, for example, those can get down to zero negative impact on the environment, but they can't contribute to the positive upside. Whereas our natural farming systems, we can reduce the negative sides of those very significantly, but we can also have them rebuild, help rebuild ecosystems. So we actually have a positive story to tell people, not just an absence of negative news, which is what those novel foods are.
I've never really put those two together before.
Yeah,
and of course I've been there, but and it adds so much to the storytelling, and then actually what you can get for the products that you produce off that as well. Because people, consumers like that shit.
Yep.
Especially when they're authentic and real.
Yes.
It's interesting. I heard the other day the how phenomenally impactful wetlands are for absorbing carbon as well. And you see farmers, all over the country now actively planting those, fencing them off, planting them and realising how important they are in their system.
Yeah, and they realised what a pain in the arse the wetlands were to keep them dry and to farm them. And just the way many sheep and beef farmers have taken their much harder to work land out of farming and put it back into bush, because you get those ecosystem benefits, and you might be able to even diversify a bit, put some hives in the Manukau, for example.
Yeah. Rod, the other thing, you talked before about how quickly New Zealand has denigrated our the land in New Zealand. And I remember being at the Auckland Zoo some years ago, and there was a plaque there talking about New Zealand has cut down more rainforests as a percentage than any other country in the world. Now, I'm not sure if that's still true, but I went, that can't be right. And then maybe it is.
It would be right in terms of obviously not in outright,
but as a percentage.
Yeah. So there is relatively more still standing of the Amazon as a percentage of what was the original Amazon than is left of our native bush. And indeed, actually, in the Climate Change Commissioner's draft report, there is actually a very good chart. And it's also it builds on work that Simon Upton, I think, had done as Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment in one of his reports, showing what an enormous amount of carbon we released in clearing land. And it's, that is we have some responsibility for that heritage. Now, I'm not blaming people at the time. We all make decisions on the best information we have at the time, and we now make different decisions than they would because the world's changed, we understand more and all the rest. But I still think we have some responsibility for what our forebears have done before us, just as people will be clearing up after us long after we've gone.
And Rod, it's interesting when you get the biodiversity working, and we're another 12 months on with our regenerative program on our small block, and we are seeing progress now. We're starting to see under the ground. It was interesting because I'm a magnificent sulker at times, Rod, when I like instant gratification, and the regenerative conversion has been slow. And we had Jules Matthews came in and measured under the ground of what was going on, and we're digging up, and it was amazing. I felt really quite emotional to see and measure the impact we'd made in 18 months. I couldn't see it above the ground, but it was definitely happening under the ground. And it was just the most wonderful feeling of going, we are positively impacting the land we're farming on. And I couldn't get over how that this massive flowers we have there now for a far greater range of the year, with flowers from different clovers, sunflowers, whole range of things. And our production has hardly changed, if at all, than what we were doing before. And this was something I resisted for a long, long time. So it's quite interesting to see, the impact it's had on our mental health. We've got more bird life there, and that's subjective, but there's certainly a wider range and more birds on our property than we had before.
That's just such a terrific story, and I hear more and more people having that same experience. And I'm very envious because I've always lived in towns, but I've always spent a lot of time out in wild places as well. But I'm not much of a gardener. I basically sort of mow the lawn and cut back the growth. But our daughter and her husband are now back living with us from overseas, and they're great growers. And I've started growing a few things, and I can't tell you the excitement about getting the first pepper off a little thing in a pot.
Isn't it crazy?
But I'm envious of people who have a chance to work on a complete ecosystem like that, as you're doing, because what goes on under the soil is completely miraculous.
But I need help with that, Rod. That's the key thing there. Without Jules, I'd be toast, because and I've written about this numerous times, that I would very easily go back to the old agricultural cocaine of putting on, the nitrogen and phosphate to get that instant fix again and get what I had before. Because there are times I miss it and go, this is taking too long to come together.
Yeah. There's another book in this context which I just love to mention. It's by an American, Native American writer, but who's also trained in Western science. So she's very much like our Maori scientists here. Her name's Robin Wall Kimmer, Kimmer, and her book's called Braided Sweetgrass. And it's immensely powerful and insightful, wonderful read, because she's bringing both her Native American knowledge and history to all this, but her Western science too. It's completely a fascinating book.
I mean, the meeting I had just before that was, looking at blending the two together. Rod, before we get on to the next subject, the thing that struck me about Rod Carr was that he was very easy to listen to. He delivered the information, the report, it's just a summary, but he delivered it in a way that was accessible, which I thought for a scientist is a pretty bloody good achievement.
In a sense, I'm not correcting you. Though
it's okay to do that.
Well, it depends how you feel about economists. He's actually trained not as a scientist, but as an economist. So his whole background, and over the years he's been very busy with degrees, has basically been in economics and finance and in markets, resulting in him being deputy governor of the Reserve Bank, before he then ran Jade Software in Christchurch, and then he moved on to be Vice Chancellor of Canterbury University, and then now has this role. And Rod is extraordinary because he admits this himself, that he had thought a bit about climate, but not that much. And so in the year since he was appointed Climate Change Commissioner with a bunch of fellow commissioners, but he's the sort of lead committee chair, he says that I've been through the 101 paper, the 201 paper, I've gone on to I've done my bachelor's, I've done my master's, I've done my PhD, I've done my postdoc. It's been a steep learning curve for him. But that's been good in many respects because he brings a clarity to all this, and he is an excellent communicator. So he just lays out things in a very, very accessible way. A superb communicator, but based on a phenomenal amount of knowledge that he's absorbed and sorted out in his own thinking.
Yeah. And it seems as though it hasn't scared people, Rod, in that, he's delivered in a way that people have not collapsed in a heap and gone, this is all too hard.
That's true. I've been I wrestled long and hard about how to respond to the Commission's report, and it took me a week to sort of think things through before I finally wrote something. But basically, there's a lot of really good stuff in there, particularly around policy, around climate change itself, around governance processes, which are good for us. And then there's a lot of good sectoral stuff. However, the Commission has taken a fairly near-term view, particularly about using pretty much existing technologies, albeit newer and cleaner ones, to make substantial reductions in emissions, and that's fair enough. But they're very much focused on what's pretty much here now, practical and economic. And I think they've missed some really important things, of which by far the most important is this Earth view that I'm articulating here about where climate change fits into these bigger issues about our relationship with Earth systems. Because in responding to climate change, we have the potential, our best opportunity is to respond in ways that do an awful lot for the ecosystem and health as well. And that's particularly true in agriculture. So the agriculture chapter sets targets which are very easy, I would argue. Dairy NZ would argue otherwise. Federated
Look,
farmers,
I was surprised how middle of the road they were.
Yeah. To make these modest reductions in emissions using systems we already know about, but getting them around pretty much all farmers, but not even going anywhere near the discussion about that enormous upside. So it's not just about reducing emissions, it's about farming systems that are delivering so much more. So I think I'd like to see, by the time they get to their final report in May, a lot more thinking going into that much bigger context. But so I do have that rather mixed view, and if people are interested, that's easily found in my Newsroom columns about what's strong, what's not, in their various of their 17 chapters. Do you think that it was delivered in this moderate way to get more people engaged? Yes, but not as a kind of a disingenuous thing. I think it's really important for us to help people understand that for all the complexity of this, there are ways to think this through in a very clear and logical way. We've got some big, interdependent, multifaceted decisions to make, but the basic architecture of what we're trying to do, is clear and logical. So I think I think it was a really good exercise in laying things out that way, not in any kind of ulterior motive, but just to give us that sense of clarity. Now, other people do it too. So the equivalent in the UK is the British Climate Change Committee that's been running since 2008. So they've now got sort of 12 years experience at all this. And they are immensely articulate too. So it is possible, in fact it's absolutely essential, for us to be able to think through these things in ways that doesn't scare people, doesn't confuse people, doesn't make people feel it's all too hard.
So, Rod, just mindful of time, what's anything else on that subject before we move on?
No, let's move on to democracy.
Another light subject. Where should we start?
Let me start with a very specific thing. It was actually Joe Biden's inaugural address back on January the 20th. And there was a wonderful piece that was in the New Statesman magazine just the following day, where they did a textual analysis of his speech versus every other inaugural address. And it was the most, it was the angriest inaugural address, if you looked at it contextually, about the words, the issues. It was even angrier than Lincoln's on the eve of the Civil War. There's the most amazing analysis. And it draws out all sorts of things that no inaugural speech has ever centered so much on unity. And it's all charted there, even more so than FDR, at the height of the Great Depression prior to the Second World War. And I think that that's very instructive about what a calamitous state of disrepair and dysfunction the US democratic system is in at the moment, and therefore the huge job rebuild. But just out last week is the Economist Intelligence Unit's annual Democracy Index, which they've been doing since 2006. And one of the charts there shows you the 5 big things they measure, and this is very data-driven. They're not sort of sticking a wet finger in the air about democracy around the world. And so the 5 categories they measure are electoral process and pluralism, therefore, how well people are represented and how reliable is the electoral process. Political culture, particularly, across the board in terms of how responsibly and effectively politicians do their job. Third one is functioning of government. Fourth one is civil liberties. And the 5th one is political participation. And all of those categories have been in decline since 2008. So this was the worst year for democracy since the index began in 2006. And one of the crucial questions is the extent to which citizens enjoy personal freedoms. In 83% of countries, even in full democracies, that was downgraded this past year. Just as about perceptions of citizens over free choice and control of their lives. And this was across the board because they have 4 categories of full democracy, flawed democracy, hybrid regimes, and then outright authoritarian
COVID would
regimes.
have had a big impact on that.
COVID is a very big part of that, but it's not by no means the full story. And we're reminded of how precious full democracy is.
Because I looked at that. Was that the blue map that had different shades of blue?
Well, you've got 4 shades of blue for various degrees of democracy, but then there's an awful lot of red through to yellow for the rest.
Because I looked at that map and went, oh goodness, it's not that prevalent, is it?
Well, full democracies, there are only 23 of them in the world, and they only account for 8.4% of the world's population. And flawed democracies account for another 41%. But the biggest shock in this is, well, it's not a shock at all. The US slipped into the category of flawed democracies about 8 years ago, I think, as memory serves. And so they're now down to 25th in the world. And on all of those 5 categories I mentioned, they suffered serious setbacks last year. So the political culture is what ranks lowest in the US at a mere 6.25 out of 10. And that's pretty shocking in terms of dysfunctional. But then in contrast, we still hold on to our 4th position behind Norway, Iceland and Sweden. And we have slipped a little bit, particularly on, I think it was political culture and political participation, and of course on civil liberties because of COVID. But we're hanging in there, well, more than hanging in there. I think it was a good year for us for democracy, both in terms of having a reasonable election in terms of some exercise of issues and some debate on that. Obviously heavily influenced by the pandemic, which obviously put Ardern in a very favourable position for campaigning versus Collins. But I think we learned a lot about democracy. We ended up with an even more diverse parliament in terms of people and where they come from. So I take a lot of encouragement from that about us as a smaller country being only a few degrees of separation with some good democratic processes such as we have. They're still flawed. We still need to work on them in all sorts of ways. I could list some. But when we're trying to deal with these very complicated issues, such as climate and our general level of sustainability, and where the big social issues we have to deal with, and all the rest, I'm feeling pretty good about our democracy, I'd have to say.
Rod, it's interesting with this MMP, I have often been a bit perplexed by it, but I think it's actually working.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hesitate. Yes, I do have a hesitation, though. I think what I'd love to see us do is raise where we do manage to achieve some relatively broad agreement on something, so that's the benefit of MMP. But we actually raise the ambition on that. I think that too often we reach that MMP kind of consensus, but at a relatively low level of ambition. So that's why...
What does it mean? I don't know what that means.
Well, for example, on climate, I'm still not convinced that we will be able to make decisions this year that will be as bold and ambitious as we need to make. And we still don't have political consensus on what to do. National is still, has voted for the Zero Carbon Act, and it voted for the creation for the Climate Commission, and it says that it believes in sort of science-based responses. Well, that's what we're doing, but they also say that next time they're in government, they would change 7 ways that legislation, but that completely undercuts the whole purpose of that legislation, which is to give long-term continuity in our processes, legislative processes, for making these very difficult long-term decisions. So their promise to make 7 fairly major changes, it completely undercuts that. So also we're struggling to deal with housing, with taxation, all sorts of other issues, because I think we're settling for yes, it's nice we've got a common denominator thanks to MMP, but I still think we're settling for too low a common denominator. We need to raise our sights.
Rod, I was surprised how well the two minor parties, Maori Party and the Green Party, given this year, how well they did.
I was surprised a little, but I think it's testament to very important work that both parties have done in different ways. So the rebirth and re-establishment, if you like, of the Maori Party has been very significant, and the people who now lead that are quite different. And I don't mean that in any way negative about their predecessors, but there is a clarity there. I think there's a strength of a sense of where they stand and what they have to offer, what they need to achieve, that I think is different for the Maori Party. I think there's a clarity there.
Yeah, and a confidence too.
And a confidence, and a way to express that. Now, of course, both the leader and deputy leader are very new to all this, and they've got lots to learn about how Parliament works. But then, similarly, the Greens, in their own way, have established, they're still the rather diverse small party that they are, but I think they have continue to gain credibility for many people in terms of the quality of the work they do. And that's not just James Shaw on the climate portfolio, but it's a range of other people too.
Because that's the thing that's coming through with that party, is that you've got the likes of Chloe Schroebeck there, and you've got the deputy there, and Marama Davidson. You know, it's not a one-man band anymore. There is, real depth there.
Yeah.
Which something I don't see ACT has broken through yet. That ACT is looking very much like New Zealand First did a few years ago, where it's all about, one person. And they're going to have to do a hell of a lot of work for that not to be the case.
And they've got a real mismatch of views, sort of personal quasi-policy views amongst themselves. They've got a lot, as a group of people, they've got to do huge work to become clear, logical, consistent in their positions.
So just mention that. So do you think that's the key with the Greens and Māori Party, is that they have been consistent and they have been cohesive? You're not seeing, those two parties, the messages are consistent regardless of who's talking.
Yes, that's true, but there's no doubting that there's still some quite different perspectives within both parties, as there are indeed the major parties as well, and therefore there's it's always a huge ongoing challenge for leadership and membership to respect their can be quite different views within the party, but still progress in a consistent and coherent way.
And then down on the local level, Rod, in the regions, the democracies there, I'm seeing a huge, as I travel around the country, a huge array of functionality between regional councils and district councils. Te Awanga, for instance, is a classic example. But, those are still really important.
They are, and big change is coming, and it's kind of buried in one sense. So a very big task for Labour-led government in this second term is moving on from the Resource Management Act. And this is... I deliberately don't use the word reform because the new legislation will very substantially build on some very core principles of the RMA, but we'll finally get to sort out some very long-standing dysfunctions in the system. And so the blueprint for that is the Randerson report, which came out towards the end of last year. And that in itself builds on a lot of other work that's been done both by business and environmental groups and others. But as we move forward with that, with new legislation, there will be a separate sort of strategic planning act that goes alongside it. And that's inevitably going to change the structure of local government, I believe, in New Zealand, in terms of being able to deliver that. So as painful as it's going to be and difficult to navigate through, I think we will be seeing, I'm pretty sure we're going to be seeing some, I'm reluctant to use the word because it's literally what happens, but people generally consider this very negative. Some consolidation of local government into larger, better resourced councils, but crucially, those then need to learn some new ways about participatory democracy.
Yep.
So that's where I'd hope to see us starting to pick up here in New Zealand some very good ideas about how you do participatory democracy, about getting citizens far more involved. One of the processes that I like a lot are what are called citizens' assemblies and policy juries. And there's a wonderful organisation in the UK called the Sortition Foundation, Sortition. And sortition is a wonderful old word for about processes. Their work on this has been very effective in a number of countries, not just the UK, but in Ireland and elsewhere as well. And so I think we need to learn some new ways of doing participatory democracy much better. And I'd love to see us develop those skills at a local government level first, because that's where it's most urgently needed, because various local areas around the country have got to move on in terms of culture and structure and capability to be able to deal with the challenges that they have.
Rod, just going back to the ambition part you talked about before, I hear a lot of talk about this government at the moment that while they've done a stunning job through COVID, there is no question about that, that people are concerned that does this government have the ambition to really bring in some bold new initiatives? They've got a mandate, for a number of reasons. They had the most remarkable election result. That people are concerned that Jacinda might be too conservative to really push some big fundamental changes in New Zealand.
She is very crucial in this, but it doesn't entirely depend on her. And there is a conservatism there in her makeup naturally, but I don't think it's as simple as about doing nothing or not much in a classic understanding of what conservative means. She makes it very clear that her whole political philosophy is that you can only make progress if you bring a lot of people along on the journey, and it benefits people, a lot of people in the process. She wants, big change that sticks. The way I'm thinking about this is that first of all, she has got a very good head for policy. I think that's something that's not well known about her. Although she does start to say it herself a bit these days about being a policy wonk. So she understands both the politics of this, but also the politics of this, the policy of this, but also the politics of this. And so that means that I think she does take a strategic longer-term view. And as long as, and she's very good at explaining issues. So therefore, it would be possible, I believe it's possible to map out some very major change that happens relatively briskly and bring people along on that. That's why I'm going to immediately tie that back to the decisions we make on climate and carbon budgets and everything else. And I think the Commission's report gives her and her cabinet colleagues a lot of scope there to start mapping out where they're going. Now, does that mean we could also get them to think boldly about housing on the ownership and demand and affordability conundrums? They're promising things by May, and I don't know what they're going to deliver in terms of policies. But that's why I keep pushing it back to us as citizens, as voters, as electors, to get engaged, to get knowledgeable, to rally around good ideas, therefore to give politicians, particularly talented politicians like Ardern is, to actually run with that support. So I think it's up to us rather than her, is the way I'm looking at it.
Nice message. Yep, and it's I think that's a great message. So, Rod, are you ready to move on to the last subject of society?
Yes, absolutely.
Just before we do, it's the collective relief around the world I picked up when Biden was actually, went through the inaugural process. It was quite something that the relief of people I was watching on social media, the relief around the world of thank God that went through.
Yes, but only about 55% of Americans.
Yes.
It might have been a slightly higher percentage, but not much. I mean, there's a lot of people who love Trump to bits, and I mean, that's true here in New Zealand. I was quite taken aback at the time of the 2016 election. Twice, shortly before the election, in less than a week, I was having conversations with two people who I hardly knew. And I wouldn't have been able to characterize them politically, I don't think. They were both sort of middle-aged white males. But anyway, they were just riffing on Trump. And they just had learnt all his great lines. It was like going to a rock and roll concert where you're singing along with the Rolling Stones. You know, I mean, that's the sort of impact he had on people. And they loved him to bits. And I was going, God, words failed me. So he is a genius in certain respects about being able to get inside people's heads or speaking to their greatest fears and all the rest. So Trumpism hasn't gone away. I'm not even sure Trump has. But anyway, still it is a relief that there is competent government. Of course, those come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and degrees of competence. But actually some useful things are being done. But also politically, the Democrats can just about, in these next 2 years, if they're bold, get stuff through Congress.
Yeah, and look, they've started off with a history rule. And look, next year with this podcast, I'd love to explore what is socialism, and because there's been all sorts of, I'm going, where are the lines? Because there's been so much conversation, and I haven't quite been able to get anybody to itemise what is socialism. And I don't know, have you got a quick analogy for me? Yeah.
The way I think about it is whatever we thought about socialism, it's not that anymore. But in that sense that as a society we have to get our act together to do some stuff, that to me is what socialism is. And so I'm not defining it as state owns everything and limits drastically your economic liberty and everything else. It's about societies coming together to get stuff done. That to me is my current working definition of a degree. If I'm known as a socialist, but if I can define it on my terms rather than the old, boring, conventional, and out of date and always wrong ones, then I'd be happy to be called a socialist in that sense. Okay,
because I mean I'm okay with that definition, because somebody said to me recently, "Are you a socialist?" I said, "I'm buggered if I know. I don't know what I am." Because I listened to a great podcast. It was the founder of Whole Foods, and he was just very anti-socialism, and was communism and so forth, and was very pro conscious capitalism, and it was a great argument, and I listened to him and went, okay, so maybe I'm a conscious capitalist, but the way he was talking about the Democrats, I thought he's talking about them as though they are communists, and I'm thinking, this is really confusing.
Yeah, it is very confusing. I'm happy to call myself a capitalist, but I'm very quick to define that I'm interested in a number of capitals. I'm very interested in financial capital. I'm a business journalist, but I'm also incredibly interested in social capital and natural capital and human capital and intellectual capital. And it's an old line. So old, I'm not sure, I don't even remember who said it. There's nothing wrong with capitalism. It's just we haven't tried it properly yet. All we've done has been the financial capital side.
Right.
It gets ever more extraordinary as the recent stories about GameStop and everything else going on stock markets. But if we think of capital in those integrated ways, then in a sense, yes, we are all capitalists, but we do care about those other capitals as well. And we are socialists in the sense that we do own things collectively. We New Zealanders, this is our land, I know that's very complicated because of colonial history and Waitangi settlements and all the rest. But we, the people of New Zealand, this is our place. That's a collective ownership.
Yeah.
So the social capital we have here and the crying need to lift and spread more evenly or raise those disadvantages in terms of human capital are all important. So we are socialists in that sense. There's a lot of common ownership here. And it has to be collective ownership of the problems. We have to agree that actually this is a problem. It's our problem to solve. And be collective owners of the solutions as well.
Look, the great irony, Rod, this year is that looking after the people first with COVID, lo and behold, has been the best thing for business. Where in other countries where they try to look after the business first, the business suffered, the people suffered. We are currently going through recertification as a B Corp. And it just reminds me what a phenomenal framework it is and how hard it is. But we are, going through the policies, and every 3 years they up the standards and so forth, and you line up and go, okay, here we go, are we still good enough to be a B Corp? And, hopefully our mark improves this year. But there are some wonderful frameworks in there, and it focuses, so many of them focus around the people and looking after the people, because when you do that, the business goes better. And there's one policy, I'm not sure if it's new, but I don't remember it last year, but we have now got implementing a thing called a whistleblower policy, whereby all the staff and facilitators and everybody who works with us have got somebody outside of the business that they can contact if there's any sexual misconduct, bullying, financial concerns, whatever, that we will have a whistleblower policy that anybody can pick up the phone and report to this person that sits on the outside of the company. And it's just a safety valve. Now, hopefully it never ever gets used, but just having it there is such a wonderful policy. I would have never thought that up. But this B-Lab certification has gone, that's something that we could utilise. Very easy to put in place, costs nothing, but it's there.
It's very wise, because so much of the damage, both the individuals involved but the organisation as a whole, happens because things get swept under the carpet and not dealt with. So if there's a straightforward mechanism where you don't feel threatened or in danger if you feel a victim or you're seeking redress on something, and that can be done in a fair and effective and efficient way, speedy way, fabulous.
So anyway, that's, and B Corp is a capitalist process because it's there for businesses that make a profit. So, yeah. Okay, ready to move on? Next, simple subject, society.
Yes, I mean, in some ways we've been, society has been part of the conversation all the way through here. And I think we're at a fascinating stage in New Zealand where we are actually a very diverse country. A very high proportion of us, and I'm obviously speaking as one, were born outside the country. And yet we feel a strong sense of belonging here, a strong affinity here. And I think I worry, though, that we still take that a little bit too casually. So here in Auckland, we are the fourth most immigrant-intensive city in the world in terms of the proportion of people born outside the country. And we're jogging along okay, but I'd love us to see us being more mindful about how we're doing that, to make sure that people feel very comfortable in being able to express who they are as New Zealanders, but bringing with them some other context or ethnicity as part of that. And that, of course, we've still got lots to learn there, because the fundamental relationship between Māori and Crown, as represented by the Treaty of Waitangi, and that relationship is very fundamental to our identity and progress as a country. But I'm always very intrigued and fascinated and encouraged by how generous various iwi and hapu individuals are in embracing that diversity. And I think one of the wonderful things that's been going on over recent years is, on one hand, a greater confidence in Māoridom about people and place, but also being open with others. I feel this very strongly in our relationships in the Edmund Hillary Fellowship, for example, where, so as we're developing sort of kaupapa EHF, we're very wonderfully held in kaupapa Māori with Te Awanga, and that is a very special relationship. So I think we've got all the elements here that can help us develop into a very well integrated society, but not in the sense of we all start to, integrate the way the Americans do. You all end up being so vaguely American. I think we'll all hold on to our strong identities here, but have that overarching sense of what it means to be a person here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and this place we call home. So, but that in no way underestimates the huge challenges we have in terms of deprivation and disadvantage for so many people across society. So we've got some very hard work to do, both in policy and political and economic and social terms and cultural terms, to address all those deficiencies.
And COVID has made all those things worse.
Absolutely. The same as in every other country, the essential workers are those whose work really is essential. It can't be done remotely from home, and they're in the front line. And so often those are people who could have considerable skills, like in the health profession, but are often inadequately paid for what they do. And the most serious job losses, and compared to the other countries, they've been light here in New Zealand, but they've been the people who've come out of this best are older, skilled Pākehā, not Māori, Pacifica people, particularly younger ones, and people with less skills. Those have been the disadvantaged here through the pandemic, just as they have been overseas, but not obviously as grievously as, but still seriously, but not as grievously as overseas.
Rod, this last week that's just been with the Waitangi Day, you and I have seen some very fraught weeks around that and lots of discontent. And I was reflecting that this last Waitangi Day was one of the most harmonious I think I can remember. And it's a reflection of the phenomenal amount of work that's been done behind the scenes for years and years and years. And we are making progress. We are, absolutely. And it just makes me hungry for more to see where this takes us. I have got a hui on March the 8th. I was challenged by a wonderful woman, Maori woman, a few months ago before Christmas, and she said, Harv, I would like to see Collective Intelligence honour the treaty as a private organisation. And I said, cool, okay, what does that look like? She said, I don't know. And but she said, I think if anybody could take that on, I think you guys could. And I went, okay. So then I've consulted with a number of other Māori leaders, and we had our first online hui, and we've agreed to get together and explore this. And it's interesting because I'm really excited by it. And it's around trying to get a practical framework for private organisations to sit about and look at how we can do this. Because, state organisations and whatever have got the means to do this and have been doing it well, but private organisations haven't. And I've, from a white Pākehā company, look at seeing Māoridom gain momentum, confidence, voice, culture, and that is turning quickly. And I see that gap between private organisations and Māoridom, I see that gap growing. And that you look at it and go, how do we embrace with that? Because they're becoming more eloquent all the time. And it's intimidating. It's intimidating to see that and go, so how do we work with that? And so I'm really interested to see, and of course Māori are so generous. They, have all come to the table and said, "Yep, we'll help you with that," and put together a framework. And interestingly, they have categorically said, "We are not going to please all Māori, and that's okay. We'll get something sorted, and we'll get started. And we're not going to try and please everybody." So I'm really interested to see what comes of that.
Well, I'm very intrigued too. I look forward to hearing about that, because that's a very rich, honourable thing to do, and I think you'll find great benefits flow from it for you and everyone you work with. I'm very keen to hear how that progresses.
And it's interesting because I know the benefits are there, because whenever we embrace Māori values and culture, our business goes better. So we know that already, the little bit that we have used. I then got challenged. I got challenged by Aniki Goodall, actually. He said, "So you'll do it because it's the right thing." And it's funny. I struggled with it initially because I couldn't quite crystallise in my mind what's the right thing, and I grappled with that for a good 6 or 8 weeks. And then it dawned on me one day, of course it's the right thing, because it gives us a chance to honour the treaty. So it was fascinating that I didn't get to that place automatically, and I can be a bit slow with that. But also know when I learn something slowly, it's often a good thing. So it was just like one day I went, oh, of course, yes, it actually gives me a chance to honour the treaty, which I've never thought about as an individual.
Yes, it's always something that somehow the government did.
It's over there, yeah. Do that over there.
But Annika, in his wonderful way, is very gently challenging us all there, because it's the right thing to do in the sense of that's what the treaty is about, and that's our future as a country. But it's also the right thing to do in terms of how much better we will be for doing so. What it liberates in us, what creativity it unleashes for us, and I started to see this at a little while back when our daughter was mid-teens, because amongst her friends they were a pretty diverse bunch of people, and they were very respectful of each other's cultures, and felt very comfortable interacting with each other's cultures, but they weren't trying to make this into some kind of mash-up culture. And now they're young adults. 15 years on, it's wonderful seeing them interact together and have this extraordinary richness in each other's lives, and understanding and appreciation of each other's cultures, but still all very much, it is who they are as New Zealanders. And I find that extraordinarily powerful, and makes me wonder if we might be able to achieve something quite different here and better, where we are bringing together Mataranga Māori knowledge and understanding with Mataranga Pākehā, if you like, and just achieving a depth and integrity to what we're doing that will really define us as a country and help us through difficult challenges, but also help us to fulfill more of the potential we have as people, and more of the potential of this remarkable land down here in the South Pacific.
So, Rod, to wrap up this podcast, what's your predictions for the year ahead?
I always find those hard because I know there's a bit too much of a finger on the scales in terms of what I would hope would happen, in terms of what I think needs to happen. But I will make a very loose, broad prediction that by the end of this year, we will be much further on that journey towards a deeply sustainable and sort of reciprocal relationship with each other as people, but most importantly of all, and very much informed by our relationship with the earth and this place of Aotearoa. And we'll have expression of that in climate policy and some new economic policy and some more social progress, and for all the unknown pandemic problems which will inevitably surface, and how in the course of the year, how we deal with that. So I think this will be a year of good progress.
And I think the blessing of COVID, which we didn't quite get with the financial crisis, is that COVID has given us a big wake-up call, that business as usual is not an option. And apparently we're only a couple of years away from our next pandemic is going to arise somewhere because of deforestation and so forth. But yeah, I see a shift going on there now that and I remember the quote from last year's podcast with you, Rod, which was, the greatest thing we could do is to actually fall in love with nature as a human species. And maybe we'd start to move closer towards that.
That would be good.
Rod, thank you for your time. Good luck with the growing things in your garden, but you might even get good at it. That would be that could be catchy. Rod, thank you. And just quickly, tell us about your trip on the trail last year. How did you enjoy that? Because you were preparing for that.
Oh, it was a fantastic adventure. Not in the sense of terribly difficult. I mean, there were some long days. 8, 10, 12 hours of cycling, but it was so extraordinary because it was a wonderful chance to see the country and people up close, and just the wonderful social life of the tour. So my blog of that is on my website, nz2050.nz, and there's a tab there, Tour Aotearoa. I set off on February 27th. This time last time I was riding on my own in the company of many others, but this time my good friend Kennedy Warren's coming with me, and we're on another of the Kennett brothers' great routes, which is Cape Egmont in Taranaki to East Cape, and then down to Gisborne. So that's about 1,200 k, and we'll do that over about 12 days. And it's very hilly in the middle of the North Island. We've got 16,000 metres of climbing to do, uphill and down dale to get across the island.
And so you go from you come inland to...
Yep, just come...
Pew?
Come inland from Cape Egmont across the flank of Mount Taranaki, just graze the corner of New Plymouth before heading up to Wangamomina, and then over towards the centre North Island and the Timber Trail in there, which is a great cycleway, and then dropping down, swinging around and coming down lake to the eastern side of Lake Waikaremoana, and then swinging back up to the coast for the last bit round to East Cape, and then coming down from East Cape to Gisborne.
And is that on a road bike or a mountain bike?
I ride a gravel bike, which is no suspension, but looks a bit more like a mountain bike than a road bike.
Right. Good luck with that, Rod. Hopefully the weather is good, and thank you very much for the annual interview.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Harv, and all the best for this year.
Thank you. You've just been listening to an episode of Stuff That Matters Now, brought to you by Collective Intelligence. I hope you enjoyed listening to the fun stuff, the rugged stuff, and the complete stuff-ups that have helped this particular Collective Intelligence member evolve while making the world a better place. Do check out our Stuff That Matters Now podcast series on your favourite podcast provider, or visit our website www.collectiveintelligence.co.nz to get links to new episodes. Contact us if you want to learn more about how we can help you evolve yourself and others. Thanks for listening.